Well, I'll let her know when she's out.
Yeah, okay, no worries.
Yes, we are live streaming. As you can see us on YouTube.
Yeah.
So that's very encouraging. Morning, Ron.
Hiya.
Yeah.
You can't do a thing about background on Zoom, can you?
I'm not sure how you do that.
I've been trying to. Okay, not to worry. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Bronwyn. Happy New Year.
You too.
You all right?
Yes, yes. Apart from I had a fall just after Christmas, so I'm a bit hobbled.
Oh dear. Oh no. Hope you get better soon. Don't be going out in the snow. You don't
No,
want-
no. Ice will be my bête noire at the moment.
It looks pretty, but treacherous. The garden looks nice.
Works for me.
It's the only advantage of working from home, isn't it? Or one of them, that you don't have to go out in this weather.
Quite right.
Can we just make you all aware that we are live streaming at the moment? It's we've had a couple of technical issues with live streaming on the last few meetings, so we just thought it might be best to live stream before the meeting starts so they don't encounter any issues as the meeting begins. Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning, Sim.
Morning.
Morning.
Sarah's just advised we have started the live stream just to make sure it's working. So we are live, but the meeting hasn't officially started. We're just awaiting a couple of other of our members to arrive. Hello, I think we're just waiting for Councillor Hinchcliffe to join us. For those who've just arrived, to advise we are live streaming, but we haven't formally started the meeting quite yet. If people are happy to wait a couple of minutes more, Councillor Hinchcliffe is expecting to come and to chair the meeting for us. So if you can bear with us for a couple of moments, and hopefully she's just been temporarily delayed.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Just to let you know, Councillor, we are live streaming, but we haven't started the meeting. We're just making sure we don't have any technical hitches with the live streaming.
No technical hitches then, Angela?
Understand all looks fine?
That's super then. So let me just go to our papers. Start. I'm chairing today, so obviously I'm just a temporary chair whilst we get the chairing sorted out. So this is a Governance and Audit Committee meeting. Welcome to that. Have we got apologies for absence, Angela?
We received apologies from Councillor Swift, for whom Councillor Scullion is substituting today.
Welcome, Councillor Scullion. Anybody else?
No, not aware of.
Thank you very much. Declarations of disclosable pecuniary interest, anything at all? No, that's lovely. So please do declare in the agenda if you see something coming up which you think you need to declare on. Exclusion of the press and public, I don't think there is anything in this, is there?
Correct. There's nothing.
Lovely. Moving on now then to the minutes of the meeting of the Governance and Audit Committee held on 27th of November. Anything in there that people need to comment or question? I'm afraid I can't, because that wasn't a meeting I was able to attend. No. In that case, can I suggest we pass those minutes as a correct record of that meeting? Thank you very much. Moving on now then to Treasury Management. And I believe we've got guests in the room from Leeds Council. Welcome. Who manage our treasury for us, and are going to give us a presentation on how they do that and what strengths and weaknesses of our operation are. So can I pass out? Is it David Brown? Is it who's going to present on that?
I think Bipinder's going to start this off, but I will be joining in. So Pinder.
Thanks, David. Thanks,
Welcome.
Councillor. Yes, good morning all. I'm rather glad that I'm doing this from home rather than looking out of the window and having to fight through the snow. So that's a plus to start off with. So this presentation here is on Treasury Management, and it's as much to enable members on the call to understand what Treasury Management is about and what are some of the risks that are involved in the way that we look at and govern Treasury Management, so that members can, if you like, question what we do and how we do it, but also to, more importantly, further their own understanding of the processes that are involved. So the presentation that we've got lined up for you will be undertaken by myself, David Brown, and Angela will come in at some point as well on the presentation. So the outline of what we're proposing to discuss is on the next slide, which will introduce you to the Treasury team at Leeds City Council. Then we'll look at the Treasury Management Framework, including the definition, the legislative framework, the reporting mechanism and the governance. And these are the basic mechanics and guidelines within which the Treasury function operates. And allied to that, number 3 there is where this committee comes in and what your role is as members of ensuring that Treasury Management takes place in line with that framework and the strategy is relevant for the combined authority. Finally, we will take you through the strategy, the work streams, the debt that we have on our books, our approach to investments, and the economic environment within which we work, which, as we all are aware, is constantly changing. We have some time at the end for some questions, but by all means, if members feel that they want any clarification or they want to ask a question as we go through the presentation, then please feel free to ask that at any point through the presentation. So if I can ask my colleague Dave Brown now to take us, well, firstly I'll introduce, it's myself that heads up the Treasury function, and you'll be familiar with Angela and John at the combined authority side. But in terms of Leeds, there's myself that heads up the operation. We have the next 3 people are more or less full-time on Treasury Management, looking at obviously the position for Leeds City Council, but also looking at the combined authority as well. David Brown, who will then carry on with the presentation, is a senior Treasury Manager. He then has the support of Sarah Myers and Danny Mackay, who's just also qualified as a full accountant as well. So if you could go to the next slide, and I could ask my colleague Dave Brown to come in at this point. Thank you.
Good morning all. This definition is taken out of the Code of Practice on Treasury Management, and it's the essence of what we do in terms of performing the Treasury operation, both for Leeds and for WYCA. The management of the organisation's borrowing, investments, cash flows, banking, capital and money market transactions, and effective control of the risks associated with these activities and the pursuit of optimum performance consistent with those risks. And we have an entire framework which builds on and enables us to perform and to meet this definition of treasury management. As I say, both for Leeds and for WYCA. We don't treat either organisation any differently in that respect. Can we move on to the next slide? So, legislative framework. There are a number of different codes and pieces of legislation and market directives that affect what we do. The most important of which is the Local Government Act 2003. That determines how all local authorities are organised and what their powers and responsibilities are in terms of in terms of what they need to do from a legal perspective. There are other subsidiary pieces of legislation and statutory instruments that also apply, things like the capital finance regs, which I've not mentioned on here, but that controls how you manage capital and what your responsibilities are in relation to capital expenditure. There are two specific codes of practice issued by SIPFA, which are both mentioned there, the Code of Practice for Capital Finance and the Code of Practice on Treasury Management, and taken together these form the SIPFA Code. They are both, they are twin documents which very much sit together in terms of how we manage and report on and set prudential indicators and manage against those prudential indicators. Over and above that, the MHCLG has issued guidance on local government investments in 2017, which we also have to have regard to under the 2003 Act as guidance issued by the Secretary of State. And that gives further guidance in terms of what local authorities are required to do in terms of their treasury management investments. I will make a distinction later on in terms of the different types of investments, because I believe a question was asked at your last Governance and Audit Committee, but I will come on to that when we talk about the investments further in the presentation. There's also guidance on minimum revenue provision, which is how you pay down the debt in relation to your borrowing. And I'll speak a little bit about that in the further slides. There are also, as I've mentioned, various codes of practice that we need to take account of when dealing in the money markets, and the two most pertinent are the Money Markets Code, which is a voluntary scheme, but it's issued by the Bank of England and it covers all participants in the banking markets. So we need to have regard to that. That basically sets out best practice in terms of how you trade with counterparties and with brokers in the money markets. And the last one is one that came in 2017, I believe, Markets and Financial Instruments Directive, which is an EU piece of legislation. The main upshot of this was that in terms of investments, local authorities were no longer regarded de facto as being a professional counterparty. We were relegated to being a retail counterparty, but with the option to opt up to professional status. The impact of that on the operation that we undertake is that if we wish to deal with banks and other market participants such as brokers, we need to elect to professional status rather than being regarded as a retail. You get more protections being a retail client, but you don't have the same powers and the same abilities to be able to deal in the money markets. So we've elected to opt up to professional status to allow us to continue the operation that we've undertaken for many years. Next slide. Okay. Under the Treasury Management Codes of Practice, there are 4 clauses that need to be formally adopted. The first one to create a Treasury Management Policy Statement. This is the annual report that goes to your full board in February. So I think this is something that you'll be updating soon. It's an annual statement, and this covers off your strategy for the following year. and also has your annual investment strategy in there. So within that document, you set your policy for the upcoming financial year. There's also TMPs, Treasury Management Practices. This is a document which is more of an internal looking document that looks at the attitude of the authority to risk. And there's a whole series of risks which are delineated in these TMPs. We have a document at Leeds City Council that we've produced and that we apply when performing the Treasury Management function for WYCA. There is the annual strategy, which is a Treasury Management Policy Statement. And there's also an annual report that you do after the end of the year, which looks back and says how you've done against your strategy. You have delegated responsibility for the operation of Treasury Management to Leeds City Council under a service level agreement, which has been in place under the various guises of the combined authority since, I believe, 1985. So this is a long-standing relationship that we have in terms of managing Treasury Management for you. But you also have a scheme of delegation within your authority, which delineates who is responsible for Treasury Management and what their limits and responsibilities are. And Angela will be able to talk a little bit more about that in the upcoming slides. And as part of the framework, you also need to nominate a body which is responsible for the scrutiny of Treasury Management strategy and policies, and that's the Governance and Audit Committee that I'm reporting to now. And Angela will speak a little bit more about this on the next slides. Okay, I think that's over to you, Angela.
It is, thank you, Dave. Just picking up on some of those points before, in terms of how these principles and this sort of, legislative framework works for us, we have within our constitutions designated that Governance and Audit Committee is responsible for considering Treasury Management and providing advice back to the Combined Authority where required. As part of that, there is a report that comes to the Combined Authority with the budget and with any changes being considered previously by this committee. We have done that in the past. We haven't changed anything over recent years, but that opportunity is there at each of our meetings. And certainly later on this agenda, we've got the Treasury Management draft ready to go to Combined Authority next month after you have considered it. The annual accounts come to Governance and Audit, and they are accompanied with the Treasury Management review and an update on the current year. And then you've got the one this month, which is looking ahead to the one for the next year. We do cover off in the standing report you have each time on compliance and monitoring. We report back the outcome of any of the meetings we've had with Leeds Council as part of the Treasury Management day-to-day operations, any issues that have cropped up, and bring anything to you for your consideration. So there is a mechanism there for you to see any changes needed or any issues we feel that should be brought to your attention. Next slide, please. Within that, though, however, ultimately responsibility for financial matters within local authority world sits with the statutory finance officer. That in this organisation, that statutory officer is myself, which is within Combined Authorities is Section 73 officer. So the responsibility sits with me, but the monitoring and oversight of it is shared with this committee. In my absence, that responsibility is delegated formally to the Head of Finance, John Sheard. And as referred to before, we have in place a service level agreement that sets out the nuts and bolts of how it works day to day between Combined Authority and Leeds Council. So absolutely clear who is making decisions and who's doing the tactical day-to-day work. We have regularly reviewed that. It's a couple of years since that's been done, but we will be looking at that again as part of the transition to becoming Mayoral Combined Authority and some of the changes that. So we will be looking at and bring that back to this committee. Next, within the terms of reference, the Governance and Audit Committee is the responsibility of reviewing and scrutinising the authority's financial affairs. And ultimately, this is up to you as members, what information you would like to see to consider the adequacy of the arrangements in place and ensure their compliance with statutory guidance. As Dave pointed out earlier, it does get very technical. and recognise there is a balance here of having to place some reliance on our assurances that we are following the appropriate procedures and processes. But we can pick it up when we look at the Treasury Management statement later, or later on in this presentation, if there's things you would like to see on a more regular basis, having heard what you are hearing this morning. I think that takes us back. On the next slide, we go back to Dave for some of the detail of the issues that they consider with us in setting our Treasury strategy and how we go about the day-to-day management.
Okay, thank you, Angela. There are 4 main work streams that we perform for the Combined Authority, which are detailed here, and I'll go through them in a little bit more detail. The first one is that we manage your long-term debt portfolio. The authority has 75 million of outstanding long-term loans, which are historic in nature, and there's a slide further on which gives a little bit of history about how we've got to this particular position. But we perform not just the management of investments, but the management of the long-term debt as well, and that's going to be more coming to the fore in the next few years, which is a change in terms of how the Combined Authority is now going to be financing some of its capital programme, which includes an increasing need to borrow. And we will be liaising with both Angela and John in terms of managing that process of moving from an investment authority to a more borrowing oriented authority. The second string is cash flow management and investment. The authority is currently sat on significant cash balances in excess of 400 million. And what we perform in this area is a management of those cash balances. I spoke earlier on about the question that was raised at the previous meeting, which was the difference between the different types of investment that an organisation can undertake. The question that was asked, I believe, was why is the authority investing with Croydon? We invest cash balances as we have those cash balances to manage that cash resource. There is a risk that if we were to just leave all of this money in the bank, that we'd have 400 million just with our bankers. So what we do to diversify and manage that risk is we lend this money out on a short-term basis up to 1 year in most cases with other organisations. We do this under the MHCLG rules, which is in relation to security, liquidity, and then yield. That is a prime driver of the MHCLG guidance. But the day-to-day operation is managing that cash balance that you have until such time as those cash balances are used for the purpose for which they have been given to the authority. This is the various grants, for instance, that you've been receiving, growth fund grant, and all the rest of the grants that you receive. Our job is to try and make sure that we've got the cash on hand to deliver that cash to the operational side of the Combined Authority when it's actually spending those cash balances. The third string is in relation to LCR LEP loans. These are historic in nature and are winding down. There's a reducing level of activity in these, and I can well see them in a few years disappearing completely. But there are still a few loans that we manage and give advice on because of the historic nature of when these started, when these were first with Leeds as the responsible body, and these switched over to WYCA in 2015. The last strand is the Treasury strategy advice and support, and we have regular meetings with both Angela and John where we review the strategy that we currently have in relation to the wider economic environment in which we're operating. So we're having a meeting this afternoon, which is the 4th one this year, and we'll be updating our advice and support in terms of what's currently going on in the world and how that's affecting the strategy that we have in place. Next slide, please. This is a little bit of history about how the Combined Authority has arrived at where it is today. First thing is the introduction of the Prudential Code, which was introduced in 2004. Strange to think that was 16 years ago, but there you go. Up to 2008-9, the Combined Authority, or the Passenger Transport Authority as it was at that point, operated in pretty much the same way that most local authorities did, which is that you've got revenue support for the borrowing costs that you were incurring for borrowing to support your capital programme. In 2008-9, that changed for the Passenger Transport Authority, and at that point all support for capital was through grants, and there was no borrowing, no further borrowing incurred. You had a capital financing requirement, which is your underlying need to borrow, of approximately 100 million at that point, but over the intervening time that need to borrow has slowly reduced as you've made repayments of debt, which is a technical term called MRP, minimum revenue provision. So your underlying need to borrow is just slightly above your actual stock of external borrowing, which is 75 million now. 2014, the Combined Authority came into being, which replaced the Passenger Transport Authority. And as part of that, there is a fairly substantial Transport Plus fund, which is going to increase your borrowing going forward. And that is something that we are monitoring closely with John and Angela. The grid at the bottom is just to give you a snapshot of where we are in terms of this year. We started the year with 75 million of long-term debt. You can see the capital financing requirement there and the forecast of it. And you can also see the external investments. You started the year with 233 million of investments, and that's risen to 436 currently. And we are currently forecasting that that will decrease to around 350 million by the end of the year. But that is going to be a moving feast depending on how you spend the grants that you've got and any further grants that you may get between now and the end of the year. You do have, as part of your borrowing portfolio, some loans from Barclays Bank, which were LOBOs, but they were converted in 2016 to fixed long-term loans. So they're, to all intents and purposes, equivalent to the Public Works Loans Board loans that you have, which you have 50 million of them. So they're long-term fixed funding arrangements. I don't think any of them have any maturities until the 2040s or beyond. So this is long-term fixed rate debt that is historic in nature. Next slide, please. So, touched on this slightly. I'm liaising with John, and I was talking to John over Christmas about your capital programme and the phasing of it and when you're likely to need to borrow and how we're going to manage that. So that's a process which is ongoing, and we are constantly talking about how we're going to manage this transition from being an investing authority to being a borrowing authority. When we do identify a need to borrow, there are several questions that we'll raise at that point, most notable of which is the timing of when we borrow and where we borrow from. The primary source of lending to local government is the Public Works Loans Board. This is a subsidiary of the HM Treasury and the Debt Management Office of HM Treasury. They are tasked and have a duty to lend to local government, and they have performed this for many years, probably a couple of 100 years in reality. But they are the primary source of lending to local government. Other sources, we can borrow from the markets. We have a power under the Local Government 2003 Act to borrow from any particular source that is in your Treasury strategy and in your Treasury Management policy statement. You have taken loans from banks in the past, and there are, at Leeds, we have a much larger borrowing requirement currently, and we are currently looking at arrangements with bond issuance and the like. But these are things that we are currently investigating. We've not taken any market loans on since 2006. So the PWB is the de facto standard, and that's what we benchmark against with any borrowing arrangements that we enter into. One of the things that the Code of Practice gives you is the ability to borrow in advance of need. So if you're identifying a borrowing need in, say, 2 years' time, and you think that rates are going to go up from where they are today, we're not currently foreseeing that, but if you thought that rates were going to go up, you have the power to borrow now for that capital borrowing need in future years. Given where rates are at the moment and forecasts, we're not envisaging a need to do that currently, but it's something that we keep under review. As part of your Treasury strategy, you set and refresh your Prudential indicators, and there are borrowing limits within these. The two most applicable are the operational boundary, which is a management tool to it's basically our best guess of where you will need to borrow. We set it above where your current debt level is, but it's our best guess of what borrowing you might need to undertake. But then there is a further limit called the authorized limit, and this is a legal limit that you cannot breach. Once that's set by the authority itself, you have no legal ability to borrow beyond that limit. So we set that with quite a substantial headroom to give you the flexibility, for instance, to borrow in advance of need, should you determine that that is the best course of action from a Treasury Management point of view. We currently monitor on a daily basis the yield curve, and this is primarily based on gilts. PWB rates that are issued twice a day are based on the gilt markets. So we are constantly monitoring the gilt markets for movements and looking for trends and looking for opportunities of when it's best to actually go into the market and to borrow. We also monitor short-term rates, and we are talking to the brokers every day about trades that are on offer in the markets. So we're getting a lot of intelligence both from the broking community and from online services that we have in terms of what's happening to rates, both long and short term, which affects not just the borrowing side, but also the investment side. All of this activity, both borrowing and investment, has an impact on your revenue budget, and we do forecasts of what the costs of your debt are and what the likely level of your investment income is likely to be, and what the cost of your repayment of debt is. That's the MRP that I mentioned previously. The last thing to mention on this slide is rescheduling. Up to 2006, both for Leeds and for WYCA, we were fairly active in terms of rescheduling our existing loan structures. From 2007, 2008, the Public Works Loans Board changed their operations in terms of how they would allow you to reschedule debt, and they put a differential in between new PWB borrowing rates and premature redemption rates. The effect of this was to kill any rescheduling opportunities that we've had pretty much overnight. It's very difficult to have a 1% differential, and I think it's slightly more than that, about 1.18% difference between new PWB rates and the rates that they use to calculate premature redemptions. And because of that, it just makes it uneconomic to actually reschedule any of the debt. So the debt that you currently have from the PWB is effectively locked in at the rate. We can see no opportunities for rescheduling given this differential that exists. Next slide, please. So considerations for investing. Under the MHCLG guidance on investments, we are concerned primarily with the security of capital and the risks that are associated with investing with any counterparty. I've mentioned previously SLI, security, liquidity and yield. And the first one is the really important one. Its security is the most important thing for us. It's the return of capital rather than the return on capital that we are primarily interested in. So we want to get all of the money back. Because of that, we only invest with the best rated counterparties that are in the market. We have a counterparty list which is constructed by our Treasury advisors, and this covers all of the major banks in the world, and it's driven by their credit ratings, which are from the 3 major credit ratings agencies, and that's then overlaid by credit default swap information, which is basically how the money markets view the risk on these counterparties. There is a list of about 90 odd banks on this list, but we've taken the decision a few years ago, when banks were still having some problems and some issues, that we would rest banks, and we've not revisited that. So all of the investments that you have currently are with the local authorities, other than 2 call accounts, which are liquid cash accounts that we have, one with the authorities bankers, NatWest, and one with Svenska. All the other investments you have are with local authorities. Local authorities, in terms of the risk profile, are regarded as next to sovereign. When we're lending to another local authority, that investment is covered by the 2003 Act as borrowing on their part, and we benefit from the safe harbour provisions and all of the rest of the protections that are guaranteed within the 2003 Act, not least of which is that any investment with the local authority is secured on all the revenues of that local authority. So local authorities are regarded as being a higher counterparty risk. Sorry, not risk. Higher counterparty quality. Oh, excuse me 1 second. My phone's just going off. Just bear with me 1 sec. Apologies for that. It would carry on for about 5 minutes if I didn't answer it. So again, apologies for that. So where were we?
About local authorities being like sovereign funds.
Yes, higher credit quality than banks. So at the moment, the WYCA is being very defensive in terms of its risk appetite towards its counterparties, and we are investing only with the most secure counterparties that we can find, which are other local authorities. In terms of liquidity and yield, we do have a view in terms of liquidity. When are you going to need the cash to spend it on the purposes for which you have this cash, and getting a yield on your investments. The way we're managing this currently is to invest in fixed deposits with other local authorities predominantly. We have 378 million in fixed deposits, and we've been investing these fixed deposits on a rolling basis of 1 year investments. We've got some 2-year money as well, but we're limited in terms of your strategy into how much we can put into longer periods than a year. But we have a rolling program of investments which comprise this 378 million. And this figure goes up and down depending on trades that we make. But we have a rolling program of 12-month investments, which are maximizing the return that you can get, but still providing you with ongoing liquidity every month as this rolling program of investments matures. So at the moment, that is the best return that we can get given current market conditions. There are other types of instruments that we could deal in other than fixed term deposits. We have some call accounts as well. We've currently got in the region of 50 million in liquid cash, which is to cover any potential cash calls that you have. But there are other things like the gilts. We could invest in treasury bills, certificates of deposits, money market funds. But we compare the rates on those to what we are currently getting in terms of fixed deposits. Money market funds, for instance, are paying either 0 or 1 to 2 basis points. So there isn't much scope for diversifying away from fixed term deposits in the current environment. Some of the other instruments that we can deal in, such as gilts and treasury bills, you do need a custody account, and there are fees associated with that. So that acts as a disincentive to invest in those particular products. I've touched on rating of counterparties. So the only thing I'd say about rating of counterparties is the bank list is separated into essentially 2 strands. We've got banks that we class as excellent, and then banks that we class as good. We have a limit of 15 million for any counterparty, including local authorities, but that includes the excellent banks as well. But we also have a lower limit and a shorter time frame that we can invest with banks that are regarded as being good, and that's a 5 million 100-day limit. But as I say, we've not invested with banks for the last 18 months due to the issues that we were seeing with banks at that time. Next slide, please. Okay, I think I've mentioned this already, but I'll just go through it, just touch on it again. 3 major credit rating agencies. We receive updates to this list on a daily basis. We have time limits and group limits for the various banking groups and individual banking counterparties. We get a full refresh of the list every week, and we have an internal overlay on top of this list, so that we will rest certain counterparties if we see in the press that there are issues with any particular counterparty. So, for instance, when the crash happened in 2008, we had taken the step to rest certain counterparties such as Northern Rock and the Icelandic banks before they became fully stressed in the markets. We were seeing information in the press that we were uncomfortable with, and we took the decision to rest those counterparties before it became a known issue. As I've already mentioned, we look at the news and the markets daily, and we're looking at what's going on in the wider world and feeding that and updating the strategy and talking to John and Angela as and when market significant information comes out that we need to be aware of. The last statement there is really pertinent. We try to manage risk to as low a level as we possibly can, but it's worth stating that no investment is without risk. We've seen some local authorities in the last couple of years issuing Section 114 notices. Now, technically, local authorities can't go bankrupt. We saw with Northamptonshire when they issued a 114 notice, the Secretary of State stepped in and put in place a regime to stabilise and to bring that local authority back to a stable position. And that's what would happen with any local authority that got into any difficulty. So we are comfortable with dealing with other local authorities as a counterparty, but it's worth saying that there is no risk-free investment. Next slide, please. This is just a brief overview of some of the things that's happening at the moment. You'll all be aware, COVID, that's had a massive impact on both the UK and global economy, but also that's fed into the wider money market. Rates currently, base rate is 0.1%, which is the lowest it's been since records began in 1694. Currently, the UK government, to manage the spending that the government is undertaking, is engaging in something called QE, quantitative easing. This is basically where the Bank of England prints money From the 2008 crash, we had 475 billion of this QE that was issued, and with COVID this year, the government have currently issued another 450 billion, which is an ongoing program. These are big numbers, and they will have an effect on money markets eventually. You would think that this would be inflationary. Printing money to this scale should be inflationary, but inflation has been almost non-existent for the last 10 years. There has been mention in the markets about negative interest rates. Europe does have negative interest rates on its policy rates. It's been mooted in the UK, but the MPC in the last couple of meetings have downplayed this particular move, but it's definitely not off the table. That will have an impact on the investment returns should that come about. But rates that we deal at are not necessarily the same as the policy rate, which is in force currently. Short-term deals, if you were to make them for 1 month, would be less than what the policy rate is. By investing longer, we're currently getting 15-20 basis points in the 1 year. UK growth is COVID has had a very serious impact on the UK economy. The second quarter showed GDP fall of 18%, but it's recovered in the third and fourth quarters. The second lockdown is going to affect this again, but it's looking like over the year we're going to have something like a 8 or 9% GDP fall over the year. If you compare that with EU GDP, theirs has been less. Theirs is 4.4% currently. And the US is about 3.5%. This is an impact of the structure of the UK economy more widely, which is very much service-based. And since people have not been engaging in services as much, the impact on the UK has been much greater. Inflation, as I've mentioned, is something that we do watch. The MPC have a target of 2% over a 2-year time horizon, and current indications are that inflation may peak above this by the end of this year, but it's something again that we will watch and will unfold over time. World economy generally due to COVID has subsided significantly, although China does look to be coming out of the doldrums a little bit, but they have some structural problems with their economy in terms of the way that they're investing and what they're investing in. And Japan has had a deflationary economy for a good 20 years now. And they're still struggling to generate any kind of inflation in their economy. So basically the outlook is that the world economy is slowing down, but how quickly and how fast it bounces back from this is an open question. But it's something that we look at in terms of economic statements by the various banks and by their economists to try and get an idea of the way the economy is going and what we should be doing to build that into our strategy. Next slide, please. And lastly, just a current projection of interest rates, which are from our advisors. As you can see, bank base rate is flat out to the start of 24. They're not seeing any increase in rates. And long-term rates are pretty subdued as well. And this is why we're fairly comfortable with not advising borrowing in advance of need at this particular moment. We don't see any significant rising interest rates, and base rate looks to be fairly well anchored for the foreseeable future. Thereafter, we expect that any rate rises would be gentle, but forecasting beyond 6 months, as an economist once said in a meeting I was at with him, he says any forecast beyond 6 months is very difficult to do from an economic perspective. So these we use as a guide, but we also are aware that there could be upside or downside to any of these projections. So I think that concludes the presentation. Are there any questions?
For that. I'll open it to questions, but just to kick off, you didn't mention the word Brexit anywhere in there in terms of financial impact. Is that still unassessed, given it's so early on?
Brexit is an evolving situation. We did reach agreement just before Christmas, the 11th hour, as is the way with these things. But Brexit is an ongoing concern. There will be impacts from it as the full implications and the impact on trade evolves. But again, that's an evolving situation, and all we can do is react to that and react to the actual shape of Brexit once it's fully and finally known. As I say, it's an evolving picture, and we tried to keep as much on top of this as we can, and it will have an effect on markets, but the detailed impact of it isn't fully known as yet. And COVID is more important and more impactful on markets at the moment, as you can see with what's happened with base rate. We were heading up in early 2019. We did an increase to 0.75% on base rate, but once the impact of COVID was known, that reduced down to 0.1% very quickly, and that is the driving economic factor at the moment. But Brexit is a concern, and that will raise its profile again as we go forward.
Thank you. Councillor Lee, did you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I've got one or two questions, please. We are the body that is responsible for scrutinising these issues. So I've got some fairly basic questions, and perhaps if I ask them all consecutively, it can be decided who addresses them.
Thank you.
The first one is the fact that Leeds Council do our Treasury Management. Are there any charges involved from Leeds Council to WYCA for these services? And how are they reviewed if there are charges? And is that a competitive rate if that's what's happening? I don't know what the arrangements are, but clearly that's something that should be reviewed regularly anyway, to see that we get the best bang for our buck in whatever we spend money on. Do we actually have the skills to operate in money markets? You know, a number of building societies lost their shirts years ago, believing that they could operate in money markets, and the subprime, I'll call it a scandal, underline that. You've got to be very clever to work in international money markets, and I just query whether we actually have those clever, rare skills, as far as I can understand it, to be able to deal in a fast-moving international marketplace. Number 4 was that we're moving towards more of a borrowing authority. Perhaps that decision's already been made. I've not been coming here very long, but I wondered who's decided that and what basis there is for becoming a borrowing authority. You know, local authorities, countries, banks, lots of people have got into terrible difficulties with over borrowing. And since we've already heard in the reports that we've already rescheduled some debt previously, we've got £75 million worth of long-term debt. Why are we looking to borrow more money as a basis for going forward? And on that £75 million debt, I think that it was reported that these were complex, very long-term loans of Leeds City Council. So if the Leeds City Council's loans that we're carrying in WYCA, are they the responsibility of all the constituent local authorities that form WYCA? And then On number 5, I was a person that asked about Croydon, and I'm actually hearing this morning that Croydon, as an example of a local authority, is deemed to be a better risk than banks. I've heard that this morning. Local authorities are deemed to be a better risk than banks. And we know that places like Northampton and Croydon have not been a good place to put one's money. And I always think if I was making an investment now, what on earth would make me go and invest in Croydon? So you also mentioned a bank, Spencer. I've never heard of that Spencer Bank, but it was mentioned up there with NatWest as one or two banks that we use. Who are they? Where are they from? You know, that's not a name that I'm familiar with. And the £75 million long-term debt is a problem. What are the actual plans to get rid of that debt? And what is the absolute cost to WYCA of servicing present debt levels? That's repayments of debt and interest. Thank you.
To lower your hand, Councillor Lee. It seems to be still on. So I don't come back to you there. So a few questions there. I'm going to start with Angela about the borrowing costs and Leeds Council loans. I believe that's because WYCA used to be managed by Leeds Council, didn't it, before the Combined Authority came into the Transport Authority used to be Leeds Council based. I think that's the history of it.
Yeah, if I may, I'll pick up a number of those points because some of them weave together a little bit around the history, and hopefully I think Dave and Bhupinder may help me out on some of the very long history of some of this. I think initially Treasury Management is our responsibility. It does take, as you say, Councillor Lee, very much expert advice and a skill set that is quite specialised. The reason we use Leeds is because we determined many years ago that we did not have that resource in-house. To create a resilient, viable team to do Treasury Management in-house was just not affordable. It would have taken a number of people, and hence we went out to rely on an organisation that had a mature Treasury Management function that could take this on. Leeds clearly do charge us for their services, but they are reviewed each year. They set out a schedule of costs. And it is actually less than the cost would be of having a permanent full-time person doing Treasury Management, because we are charged for small parts of their team and their expert advice. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that the team have their own high level of skills and experience in this, and they are supported by advisors, as Dave talked about before, where they are able to bring that in. They're also plugged into the Treasurers Network nationally. And I'm sure they can talk more eloquently than I, but they are, we would have to pay significantly more than we do at the moment to have anything approaching the skill set in-house that Leeds are able to provide us, because this isn't a full-time job. It needs full-time monitoring and control, but it has fallow periods where things are just chunking along in between. The debt we have is our debt. It is taken out in our name. These debts actually were the Passenger Transport Executive, Passenger Transport Authority that preceded the Combined Authority. So Leeds were, as part of their day-to-day management, helped put those loans in place, but the loans sit as a Combined Authority responsibility. It is a model. All local authorities carry a level of debt, and it is back to the legislation about how one manages that in an affordable way, because it is something we're allowed to do, we're enabled to do it, and we seek approval through the Combined Authority around our approach to borrowing. We haven't borrowed for a long time. The debts the 70 odd million we have goes back to a point in time where the only means we had to have sufficient funding to invest in infrastructure, for example, was through borrowing, and we had approvals from government to do that borrowing. We entered into that. It is very normal to have that over a long term. That's what makes it affordable. And our current debt costs, someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but about 6 million a year. And that's built into our budget, that is managed, that is part of the financial strategy that we put in place. And we have to demonstrate we can afford that. And that's an ongoing commitment in our books. So there is the rescheduling we talked about is about looking at whether it's possible to repay that and take it out at a lower rate. We've done that to an extent. I think it's probably over 10 years ago since we were able to last do that. But be assured that the borrowing we have is managed and controlled and is within our budget and is manageable for the required length of time until it is repaid. We do set aside an amount each year to repay it in line with the regulations, and that's we've met those every year since that borrowing was taken out. Just looking back through the questions there, Dave, is there anything you want to come in on while I just pick out if there's anything else?
So can I just Bhupinder in actually on the skills element, because obviously Bhupinder is responsible for recruiting people and will know about the market for people with this set of skills. Every local authority has them, but Bhupinder, you're obviously in charge of that.
Yeah, David has over 35 years of experience in Treasury Management, so he's been looking at these things from when we had pens and paper and no computers as well. I joined on the Treasury side in 2006, and since then we've developed our skills, and examples of that is that we work closely with MHCLG and the Treasury and SIPFA in formulating strategy around what should be the guidelines nationally. I myself has delivered presentations and panel member sessions at the London Stock Exchange to other treasurers and directors of finance. So we have a quite a detailed national profile that people look to leads in our skill sets to implement. I mean, you're quite right about the money markets and the financial world. They are very complex, and they are the tools that we have are not as extensive as you would expect somebody sat in Barclays with a whole team of analysts looking at what the markets are doing. But what we do have is through our Treasury advisors is a filter mechanism to send out warning signals around counterparty risk to us. When I look back to the credit crunch, at that time, the market was investing in institutions such as Northern Rock and Bradford and Bingley, and geographically in the Japanese banks. And before the Icelandic crisis started, we were monitoring what are called credit default swaps, which is the amount of insurance that you would have to pay when you are placing an investment with a counterparty. And we'd recognised before the market in the local authority and the advisors that the credit default swaps were way in excess of the amounts that would actually be invested. So, for instance, in the Icelandic banks, to put £10 million with a bank would cost you £6 million in insurance, and that is just an indicator there that told us that we shouldn't be doing that. So 9 months in advance of what was happening in the Icelandic banks and Northern Rock and Bradford and Bingley, we pulled out of those markets. So, and indeed, our advisors then took on our view around the need to use what credit default swaps were telling us as part of the investment criteria. So there's a lot of experience and knowledge that we have built up over the times, but we always welcome challenge and new areas to look at what the risks are around various investments. What I will say is the investments that we do are not complex structures. We've had a look at complex structures, but quite frankly, if we don't understand them, they're too complex for what we do. And as David outlined in the presentation, we are primarily considering the return of that capital, because that capital has been given to us to spend upon infrastructure or capital projects, and we are just parking that temporarily in advance of the spend on those main schemes. So when we have a counterparty list that deems what the risk is involved in those counterparties as a risk set of classification, local authorities are deemed a higher risk than banks, and that is primarily based upon a bank can fail, and you will then line up in terms of a creditor to see whether you will get a penny in the pound for what has been invested. But with a local authority, because of the protections under the 2003 Act, we have effectively a sovereign government guarantee that that money will be returned. And I suppose it is worth pointing out that 95% of investments with the Icelandic banks were eventually returned. There's about 5% that's left there to return. However, I do accept the points that within that class of local authorities, some are stronger than others. And we have, where we feel that it is right, we have rested certain local authorities, but we're very reluctant to do that, and even more reluctant to go out to the market and say that that is what we've done. Because as we found out with financial institutions at the time, at the time it was Robert Peston that was going out and saying that Northern Rock, they're accused of people waiting to take money out of the bank, then that, creates a snowball effect that effectively condemns that institution. Just from Leeds' perspective, the local authority market is very liquid. Leeds itself has had up to 500 million borrowed on short-term basis from other local authorities. So it's a very mature market where locals do lend to each other. And despite the Section 114 notices that have been issued for those authorities that have money placed with those authorities, it is as much as a cast iron guarantee can be, but those deposits will be returned.
Thank you, Bhupinder. So that very detailed explanation there. It sounds like from the Croydon question that Councillor Lee questioned that there is a almost cast iron guarantee to get the money back, basically, if there's a local authority in that vein. But we actually understand that you can't talk about which authorities you're avoiding for the sensitive market reasons you mentioned. I'm seeing Councillor Pandor's come off mute, so indicating he wants to ask a question. So do you want to ask? I think there's just one final question which I'll come back to David on from Councillor Lee's questions, but Councillor Shbir,
it's not really a question, Susan, it's just a comment and observation. It always intrigues me when we get Treasury Management reports in council. We had one hours yesterday at full council, and the debate was very similar, and the comments are very similar, which is really, really good. And one of the things I actually reflected on was suddenly all councillors across all parties, even my own cabinet member, became a financial planner and a financial investor and expert, talking about LIBOR and investment and negative interest rates and all the rest of it. The debate was really, really good, really, really helpful. But I then stood up and I actually said that actually, what is our role as politicians? And I know this makeup of this body is a bit different. My role as a politician is not really to become an expert in anything, to be honest with you. We've got a team of people who come forward and provide a very, very, very good reports. In this case, the excellent presentation we had around Treasury Management. And what I said was that, what is it that we're trying to achieve? What's the politics? I don't mean party politics. What's the politics of our organisation? And from my point of view, the politics is how we provide the best service from cradle to grave. That includes early years, it includes the schooling, and then post 16. And for our case, it's the skill stuff that we're talking about, adult education. And in this instance, it's the regeneration. It's also in making a big impact around the growth strategy and the investment stuff that we're doing. But how does that then relate to getting the outcomes? So we should be focused on the outcomes. So whatever the Treasury Management function is, whatever it does, Yeah, there should be a very clear linkage to the outcomes and how that creates a bigger bang for our book, sort of speaking. And we talked about the credit crunch. Well, the credit crunch was man-made, wasn't it? You know, that was something where within a given system, within the standards, yeah, the system failed. The pandemic is very, very different. The pandemic actually happened, it was a natural disaster, which also probably brought the system into some kind of a failure mode. But that's where government stepped in, like it did with the credit crunch. You know, so we live in a time where, you know, as really talking to the politicians here, you know, what is it we're trying to achieve? What is the outcome we're trying to achieve in terms of the new challenges that are facing us? Because, you know, it's not just a financial, operational, reputation management or managing of that risk. So I think I'd just like to reflect in terms of how we move forward, right? Yeah, is how that treasury management directly correlates and links into the business and the outcomes of the combined authority, which is probably a bit of a challenge for us in terms of how we think out of the box and how we think not as experts in terms of the subject matter, but as experts in terms of understanding our communities, understanding the region, and understanding the bigger challenges that we are facing, not just locally, but also regionally and internationally, because, you know, on the back of the opportunities Brexit will create, you know, there's also a role for Treasury Management to actually, you know, keep us better informed in terms of our ambitions. Just so add that in, Susan. It's just like
thank
really
you, Councillor Pandor.
yeah, and I didn't want to make too many points about the actual nuts and bolts of the technicalities. That's not my role. Okay.
No, absolutely. I think it's a very good point, and bringing us to politicians, I think I personally see our role in this as making sure that the risk that we task the Treasury Management team with doing is in place, really. And we've talked a number of times about our risk management strategy, haven't we, both here and in combined authority members meetings, about how we manage that. And I think that, from my point of view, I want to make sure that the Treasury Management team is using a risk profile that we as leaders are comfortable with. And I suppose that's where I would like to sort of probe a little bit to make sure that that is in compliance. You know, how are we very safe? Are we sort of medium? Are we having a risky investment strategy compared to other authorities and other mayoral combined authorities? So just going on Councillor Pandor's point, obviously we're absolutely right. We're not financial strategists ourselves, unfortunately. We don't have those skills, but obviously we're asking the questions as politicians about, you know, making sure that the strategy is the right one, so that we can actually generate the revenue that Councillor Shabir Pandor mentions there about, to sustain all the outcomes that we want to achieve. Because obviously we've got some very stern targets in terms of economy, jobs, skills, transport, and we want to be able to deliver those without compromise. And therefore we have to be able to rely on Treasury Management to deliver what we expect in terms of revenue to the organisation. So if perhaps, Angela, can you perhaps comment on that?
Yeah, I think actually Councillor Pandor put his finger on it there, because this is about how we best use the resources we have available. And when we're setting our budget, you're right, we could go out and use the funding we've got to invest in projects that make a difference to people. We could use it to invest in infrastructure. We could take out borrowing to help make that happen. But if we do that, it has to be in a way that's affordable, or we use the cash that we've got available. So you're absolutely right. It's how we use that package of resources in the best way. When we get down to the tactical day-to-day Treasury management, we always go back to the point that the approach we take, and much of what you've just heard in the slides is encapsulated in our Treasury management position in a later agenda item, is about protecting that cash. We may have some funding for a particular program or project where we might have a different approach to risk, but in terms of our day-to-day cash, we need to make sure that that cash returns to us. So our focus is making sure that the cash is protected. And yes, we only earn 0.3, 0.4, if we're lucky, 0.5% of 1% of interest on it, but we are comforted that the money should come back to us, because much of the cash that we talked about before is all earmarked. It is funding that's come in specifically for capital programs, it's for growth deal, it's for the Leeds Public Transport Investment Programme, and we need to know that money we put out with counterparties is going to come back to us so we can spend it on the projects that you've all agreed as councillors that you want us to spend them on.
Thank you. So I'm just conscious, obviously, we've got a few more items on the agenda, so I don't want to spend much more time on Treasury Management. But Councillor Lee, do you have a quick question to come back in on?
Yes, thanks, Chair. It's just to say that, you know, whatever this means to individuals attending this meeting is about governance and Treasury Management. And in that respect, we are the body which has to scrutinise the arrangements. So I hope that Councillor Pandor and nobody else is seeking to suppress anybody's right to ask questions, genuinely held questions, non-political in this case, in my case, just testing questions to make sure that we're getting it right as the people responsible for scrutiny. And that's all I've been attempting to do with my questions this morning.
Sorry, Steve. I think you misunderstood me. I reflected on my own council, and I never ever mentioned yourself. So my apologies if you. Yeah, I'm just thinking that Treasury is quite. I'm personally not qualified to actually, you know, to make a judgment on a good management policy or strategy or whatever. Yeah, I'm just sort of trying to reflect on myself in terms of what value can I add to the Treasury Management, and I was just trying to bring a different perspective in terms of looking at outcome. So there was no way in having a go at you, Steve. I would never do that. I hope you know me well enough, right? Yeah, not just as a councillor, but also working with me before when you were in the chamber, right? Yeah, it's just that, you know, I always try to go back to my role as a politician rather than trying to be something myself that I'm not. So I hope that's clarified it. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Pandor. So obviously our role here as politicians is to ask questions that people in the street might well expect us to ask, and therefore that's any question you like, basically. But I think obviously we rely on the expertise provided to us by the council officers to provide those reports, but obviously we need to ask questions and probing questions to make sure we're getting best value for money and that we are able to sustain that revenue, which will enable us to deliver all the outcomes that we as politicians and as the people want to see. So any other questions before we move on to the next report? No, I can't see anything. So obviously the report is for noting, but I'd just ask about the risk management approach, Angela. Again, I'm not sure when it's coming back to a governance and audit to that, but I think that's something perhaps we need to just always keep in our line of sight.
Yeah, we can pick that up. We've got the draft Treasury Management strategy on the agenda, and maybe we need to draw out a bit clearer in very simple words what the approach is to risk. It is in there, but maybe we need to put a bit more up front when we take it back to Command Authority. We'll pick that up in a later agenda item.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you to Bipinda and David for coming and presenting this morning. This is obviously something, it's a difficult subject, isn't it, given where we are? It's not that easy to navigate your way around these markets in these volatile times. So thank you for all you do. And let's make sure that we continue managing it well and get the revenue that, as Councillor Shabir Pandor said, enables us to deliver the outcomes that we also want to achieve. So thank you very much.
Okay.
So moving on to the next item, which I believe is the Internal Audit Progress Report.
I'll kick that off, Chair, if that's all right. The reports, I think, speak for themselves, and we had an audit committee not that long ago, so there isn't an awful lot of extra reporting to share at this meeting. So we've updated where we thought there were some significant things to share as per the report. We've also taken the opportunity to put the revised charter in, which brings us up to compliance with the public sector internal audit standards. There were a few bits that came out of the external quality assessment in 2019, and the charter has been updated to make sure that we're fully compliant with that. So that's for noting, and any comments that anyone wants to raise. But there were just two things that I wanted to draw out, that since we published the papers, one of the top risks in the progress report appendix had highlighted that MCA deadlines were definitely a risk that I am concerned about. We've been doing an awful lot of work on advice and guidance around the various work streams supporting that. But I just wanted to flesh out that risk a little bit. I think the risk is slightly larger now in the sense of what's actually happening with elections and potential delays to elections. I think that an early decision on that would help to mitigate that risk, but I think it's important just to say that's on our radar as something that we need to keep an eye on, because we can see lots of potential for work to be done that then is replicated at a point at which we don't really have resources that can be expended on work that is really not helpful. So I just wanted to expand that is on my horizon, my radar. And on a positive note, because audit needs to be positive in my view, the progress on the integrated corporate system is going extremely well. We've got through the first stage of the procurement around that, and we have, as the project board for that work, we've been looking at the technology that's on offer, the solution that's being proposed. We've had some demonstrations on that, and I have to say I feel very positive about it. I think as a system it's looking very good. It could offer us lots of opportunities to improve efficiencies, get better interdependencies between finance, HR, payroll. And I think that's going to give us real opportunities to make compliance and monitoring easier. So I think the progress that particular work stream is making is worth noting on a positive level. So those are the two bits I just wanted to bring out. And I think the easiest thing is for me just to take questions, if that's all right, Joe.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions?
Sorry about that. My screen froze for a moment there, so I was temporarily unable to speak, mute, etc. So sorry about that. And so the MCA query that you raised there, Bronwyn, about risk to elections, we obviously got a paper on the end about MCA, haven't we? So you might want to revisit that. But is there anything else in the internal audit progress report that anybody wants to comment on? No, fine, okay. Well, in that case, you're making good progress by the sounds of it, Bronwyn. And we'll come back to the MCA risk in the final paper. External audit now then, in that case, if people are happy with that.
If I could just briefly introduce that, thank you. Yeah, a regular report from External Audit. We've at your last meeting, you approved the accounts. We have got the conclusion of that and an audit letter attached. You may recall also from the last meeting that we've had a bit of a moving around of Mark's, and that Mark Kirkham has moved on to other roles as part of the regular moving around of responsibilities, so that we don't get so in line with the ethical requirements. So Mark Dalton is now our engagement lead on this, and I think there's a couple of points he'd like to draw to your attention in the appendix on this item.
Thanks, Angela. So firstly, just to say afternoon, everyone. Nice to meet you all. As Angela says, yeah, I'm Mark Dalton, your new engagement lead from Mazars. I will let Mark outside take you through just the key messages from our annual audit letter in a moment. And then I will pick up section 6 of that report, which is the new code of audit practice, but just really briefly. I suppose just to add to Angela's introduction as well, and just to reassure the committee that not everybody at Mazars is called Mark. So on that basis, I will hand over to the other Mark, Mark Outerside. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I'll take the annual audit letter as read, and I don't propose to turn the pages on it because basically it summarises the audit completion report that was considered by yourselves back in November. The key headlines from the letter is that we provided a clear audit opinion on your accounts and on your value for money conclusion in 1920. Section 5 does highlight a proposed fee variation for some additional work that we completed in 1920 in regard to valuations of property and pensions. And Mark's already alluded to the forward look mentioned in section 6 of the letter, which Mark is going to provide some additional information on. So that said, I don't propose to dwell on this one much more other than to ask if there's any questions.
Thank you. So great to have unqualified accounts, of course. So that's always reassuring. Any questions, comments? No. And we do have Mazars are doing this for how long? As we renewed the contract, didn't we? I think, Angela.
Oh, that's a very good question. I'm not quite sure when it runs out. I think we're also having to relook at auditor appointment in the context of the change becoming Mayoral Combined Authority and with the PCC responsibility shifting. So Mazars are definitely this year. I genuinely can't recall. Mark may recall better what the current term is. They are appointed, you recall, PSAA, the arrangement we have is that public sector auditor appointments do that appointment process for us. And Mazars have been with us for a few years now. Apologies, I can't recall the timings exactly.
No problem, I'm happy to chip in, Angela. So I believe there's a further 3 years of that contract remaining under the PSA arrangement.
And then we have to keep swapping you around to have different auditors who do get too comfortable with us, isn't it? That's the idea, I think.
That's exactly right, Chair. And there will be a national procurement exercise through the PSA to work to mastermind that. If I could, Chair, just to say a couple of things in relation to section 6 of the annual audit letter, which members will know on page 51 of their pack, highlights that there is a new code of audit practice for 2021. There are a couple of changes within that code of audit practice, which I'll briefly touch on today, but just to reassure the committee that we will bring a more detailed briefing to the March committee to make sure that you both fully understand and are fully up to date with those changes. But just as a kind of headline, the main headlines are that we will be moving away from a binary value for money conclusion. So we will no longer conclude on whether you have got proper arrangements in place or you haven't, and we'll be moving to an annual narrative commentary in relation to your value for money arrangements. A second element that's changing in relation to our value for money work is we are encouraged by the new code to raise concerns earlier than we've perhaps done in the past. So rather than waiting to highlight those concerns through our value for money conclusion, at the end of the audit, we are encouraged to raise any concerns as and when we become aware of them. So as and when we identify any significant weaknesses, we should be reporting those to management and also to this committee as those charged with governance. That's not me in any way, shape or form suggesting we're going to find a host of those at WYCA, but just those are the changes within the new code of audit practice. The second one is in relation to how we report our work. You have got an annual audit letter on today's agenda. That's likely to be the last annual audit letter you see for at least the next 5 years until the code is further updated. Going forward, we will issue our standard audit completion or ISA 260 report, and what will sit alongside that will be the auditor's annual report, and it's in that auditor's annual report that our annual narrative commentary on your value for money arrangements will sit. It is likely that that annual commentary is much more detailed than it's previously been, and is likely to take both management and ourselves more time to develop before it's presented to you as an audit committee. So as I say, they're the main points that I wanted to just make you aware of now. We will bring a more detailed briefing to the next committee meeting in March, Hopefully that will nicely supplement our audit plan, which will also come to the next committee.
Thank you, Mark. So some helpful and reassuring changes there. Actually, I think the rest of the committee would agree. Obviously, we want to be cited on any problems before they happen, not after they've happened. As you can probably imagine, that's reassuring for politicians to hear. So any further questions or comments before we go on to the next item? Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question for Mark, please. The purpose of external audit is experts in a particular field look at activities and make comments on them. And I'm a great believer in that. And I know that Mazars have been doing a great job for many years. Going back to the previous discussion about investments, I just wonder whether investment strategy forms a part of the external audit and whether comments are made on that. And I say that in particular because the local authorities that have failed because of dodgy investment strategies. We all know that. So, you know, I would say if it can happen in one authority that the regime didn't actually flag that up to bodies like this one, I hope that you'll be able to assure me and the rest of the members that in our case, anything like that would be flagged up. Thank you.
Okay, and presumably the changes to audit are reflective of exactly what Councillor Lee was talking about there, Mark.
That's exactly right. So I think a key driver for the change in the audit practice is exactly some of those kind of failings at other bodies and wanting local auditors to be empowered to bring those issues to the attention of committees such as this earlier rather than later. Just to further reassure the councillor, we will be certainly looking at WYCA's arrangements, and those arrangements will include arrangements in relation to Treasury Management. Really helpful actually to be party to the presentation today, because that gives us, as your external auditors, a useful insight to those arrangements, but also the assurance being provided by that external provider to this committee. If we do have any concerns, please be assured that we will be bringing them to your attention. And as I say, under the new Code of Audit Practice, we will do so promptly.
And just Bronwyn, could you just come in by external expertise is something Councillor Lee mentioned there. And when we first set the audit strategy, we did talk about making sure there was a budget for external expertise to be brought in just for that purpose. Do you want to just talk about that?
That's correct. So we do have a budget where we can bring in specialists to look at any particular areas that we don't feel we have the right skills in the team to address. But also to say that we do take external assurance from Leeds Council's internal audit function as well around Treasury Management. And they do have the skills to do that audit, whereas we don't. So we rely on them to provide that assurance to us.
Thank you very much. So any more comments or questions before we go on to the final item on the agenda? No, so we accept that report and look forward to further reports. Alerting in the meantime, of course, hopefully there won't be, but obviously I always want to hear if there is. So finally then, onto the Mayoral Combined Authority. I noticed something that the Chair asked.
Apologies, you've missed an item.
Oh, sorry.
We've got item 8.
Apologies, I can't juggle too many screens. So sorry, just catch me up on that. I've jumped ahead in the.
So yeah, item 8 is the compliance and monitoring report, which
of course
is the. If you're happy, I'll just run briefly through what's in here and see if there's any comments or questions. So this is the regular report that comes to the regular report that comes to the committee. So take it briefly section by section. We pick up internal controls. So we're reporting here that there have been no significant changes to internal controls or breaches of those internal controls in the period. Treasury Management, we usually provide you an update on the latest meeting with Leeds Council on our Treasury arrangements. The last meeting was in October because the next one is actually this afternoon. So we'll provide an update on that in March. The key indicators, you have asked previously specifically for indicators around RIDDORs, so the reportable accidents, health and safety executive, there have been none in the period. And the other key indicators around financial controls are continued to be up to date. Under financial monitoring, there's a bit of an update there on the current position with revenue and capital budgets. We are clearly heading towards a budget paper in February. We are close to getting a balanced budget both for this year and next year. There is still a little bit of a gap to close, and we met yesterday with the budget working group to try and progress that, and we will be meeting with them again to try and finalise a position that we could take forward. It won't be a surprise to any of you from your own local authorities how difficult this year has been to set a budget. So the budget, when it goes forward in on the 4th of February, it is accompanied with the Treasury Management information that we just talked about, and there is a draft of it attached to this agenda under Appendix 5. So it is interesting. It has a fairly standard approach to our Treasury Management statement and policy. It encapsulates everything you heard earlier from Dave and Bhupinder about what underpins our approach to Treasury Management. I think picking up the tone of the conversation earlier, we do set out in here that this is about managing the risk, but it's down into sort of point 11 that we talk about that focus on security and liquidity. And I wonder whether in revising this to go forward to the Combined Authority, we'll just make sure we bring that out up front a bit more in terms of a bit more of a statement that what guides what is sitting behind all of this and the detail that flows from it is that approach to risk. And that in Treasury Management, our risk approach is such that we have a very low risk appetite for our funds that are within our Treasury Management. There is work underway on an investment strategy, which is separate to this because that is a different, looking at where we might want to undertake borrowing or use funds for other purposes. That will be coming forward to the Combined Authority over the next couple of months. This Treasury Management here is about our risk on our day-to-day cash management. We're not proposing any changes to the rules we have in place around the how we use that counterparty risk, how we make sure we don't have all our eggs in one basket, that risk is spread across a number of institutions. And at this stage, we're saying we'll continue with the existing arrangements. Did flag earlier, and it is flagged in the report, that the shift to Mayoral Combined Authority and bringing in the police will mean we need to just revisit this and make sure the arrangements we have continue to be fit. We are clear through the order that the police funding, when it passes across to us, has to be kept separate, and we just need to look at what that means in practice, the arrangements the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office have in place, and they're covered by the same regulations and the same rules, so we have no fears that that's all properly set up, but how we manage the two alongside each other. So there'll be a further report to hopefully the next meeting. Starts to stray slightly into the next item on mayoral preparations, but is relevant. This is the Treasury Management. We need to do this in February. If we need to update it for further changes, we'll bring it back to you. It doesn't have to say cast in stone for the rest of the year. If anyone has comments after the meeting, conscious you may want to look at this again in the light of what you heard earlier, please just let me know, and I'll incorporate any amendments to take through to the February meeting.
Thank you, Angela. Certainly it's been a very difficult year for budgeting and planning, hasn't it? We're not knowing what money's coming when, so very difficult monitoring when you don't really know what's going to happen by the end of the year. So well done to officers for getting us on point. I know it's been quite challenging this year. You mentioned there about our low appetite for risk. I think members are probably reassured about that, to be quite honest, in this time when we all feel it's a very risky lives we lead, and we don't know what's happening beyond our doorstep in terms of health issues, etc. So people expect us to have a low risk appetite, I think, which is reassuring. But I think it'd be useful to know how that compares with our constituent authorities' risk appetite and whether we're in line with that, so whether we're an outlier. So that would be useful to know. I don't expect you to answer now, but it'd be useful to know that.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Any comments or questions? No. Well, in that case, that report is for noting. Now we do go on to the Mayoral Combined Authority report. So apologies for that. Angela, did you want to present on that?
Thank you. Just briefly, we thought it would be sensible to bring you a bit of an update on the work underway to become MCA ready. Ron referred to it earlier in the internal audit report. There clearly is a lot of work happening, and one of there are a number of work streams addressing all the different aspects of how the organisation may need to adapt and change as the new functions and powers and funding come along. There will be a lot of decisions and options being taken through the combined authority meetings over the next couple of months. Where we are at the moment, brief update, the order that will create the Mayoral Combined Authority has been laid in front of Parliament. That happened the week before Christmas. We are expecting it to be made imminently within the next few weeks. Very, very difficult to predict. Government is clearly very challenged with many things going on at the moment, but we're hoping that later this month or early next, the order actually comes into being. So the first piece of work is what has to change to reflect that. So paragraph 2.4 just sets out about that immediate focus about how we exercise any new non-mayoral functions. There are not as many of those as you might think that need, and many of them don't need much in the way of change. We've already picked up some of the adult education changes, and the strategy has already been through the combined authority. There are a number of other functions that come in, but they are exercised concurrently with local authorities, and we are working through approvals happen with local authorities before we bring any of those in. So there won't be a huge fanfare of change as the order is laid. There is then a second phase of work, obviously, as the particularly around the PCC comes in, and equally any changes that the current combined authority might want to make around panels, committees, decision-making arrangements, and we will reflect those back in terms of options as led by combined authority. The elections were referred to earlier. We know nothing more than anyone else, but we are in close contact with our electoral team colleagues at local authorities who are in close contact with Cabinet Office, and as soon as we know anything in terms of an election date and a change to that, we will advise. We are looking at the consequences of a delay to the election. Notwithstanding that, we're continuing to focus on an assumption that it will happen on the 6th of May, such that should it be deferred, it will just be a case of us having to press pause on arrangements that are ready to go and bring them in then at the appropriate date when the election happens. But we are keeping a close eye on that, obviously, because it particularly has a real consequence on the Police and Crime Commissioner functions, which is probably the single biggest change. Once the order is made, however, this year, that should unlock the gain share for the current year. And that will be a very helpful step forward to help support the decisions that the Combined Authority made in December to invest in some of the projects towards economic recovery. I will pause at that and take any questions.
Certainly the Police and Crime Commissioner work you talked about is vital, and I know Police and Crime Commissioner has also tried to work very quickly to get everything in order to move over to the new arrangements. How is that going? Do you want to just comment on that?
It's been going well. You're right. It's been quite a task given this opportunity was only identified after last year's elections were cancelled, but we've got a number of work streams collectively where we have representation from the police, the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner and Combined Authority. So there's a team working on procurement, a team working on decision making, a team working on finance, etc. And there's multiple teams coming back together with Transition Board, and we've got good involvement from the PCC himself and from the police officers as well. Senior police officers are part of those teams as well. So it's going well. We will get to a point of ensuring that the services can continue after May, and that is the primary objective here. Just making sure that we can tweak current arrangements that they continue to function once the functions shift across to us.
Thank you, and thanks to the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office for their cooperation. I think it is important that it comes over to one body. I think it gives us much more efficiencies and much more diverse leadership across the region. I think it's really important that happens. So pleased it's progressing. Joe Wardman, you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's just really a question regarding the impact on internal audit, particularly of the OPCC moving across. I've had a quick look at audit plans for other police and crime commissioners. You know, you look at approximately 10 audits over the year. And I know WYCA has, you know, a pretty amazing audit plan, considering the, you know, the resourcing that it's got. So it's just, is that being factored in, that there's going to be an extra impact on internal audit?
Yeah,
Shall I? Oh,
no, you go ahead.
I'll start, and Ron's probably closer to the work, but just to reassure you that yes, we are aware of it. There is an internal audit function already that operates across the police, the PCC office, and the police, and we've also got our audit team, and we are looking at how they work together. It's an odd time here at the moment. Until the order is made, we can't formally do too much. So there are conversations happening, and Ron's in part of those conversations about what the internal audit work might be next year and how that is discharged, given there is a team already in one organisation and we have a team here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just to add to that, to say that we're doing that work as a subgroup, so that it's actually dedicated to looking at just the audit side of things, and that's with the PCC, the police, and ourselves. So hopefully we'll get somewhere sensible.
Hopefully. There'll probably be some interesting reviews there, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Jo. Any further questions about this? Obviously, it's a moving feast. We've all got to remain very fleet of foot these days, haven't we? We never know what's going to happen next. So let's make sure we do on this last item. So I think that's the end of the meeting, unless I've missed out any other agenda items. Angela, do correct me.
No, we have done everything. Thank you.
Well, in that case, can I just thank everybody for their attendance at the meeting? When is the next meeting? Have you got a note for that, Angela?
It's 18th of March.
Okay, lovely. And there's going to be obviously changes again by the 18th of March. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attendance, and keep safe. All the best. Bye-bye.